Check out my garden. Here's some sage. We have transplanted the peppers. That right there is an apocalypse scorpion. Don't touch that with your bare hands. And some other peppers, all nicely transplanted. Tomatoes, blueberries, strawberries. I know, I do that every single time. Funny. I just did this whole entry and then realized I didn't hit record. Well played, technology. Nice one. So, we come to the Ascension. Finally, we're in the book of Acts. An event like the baptism of Jesus, like the transfiguration, like a lot of Jesus' life, that has in my lifetime, among many Christians I've known anyway, gotten a bit of short shrift. But it's hugely important. There's no way to keep this short, so I'm just going to break this up into 3 different entries. This first entry, I'm going to try and think about the question, who is Jesus for the Ascension? So without further ado, Acts 1. Here we go again with 2 guys in white robes. What's the deal? So Jesus has died, Jesus has risen, Jesus has appeared to many. The Ascension is the final resurrection appearance, which means that it's gospel, and if it's gospel, then we know that it saves us. But how? Okay, so a lot of things. First, the Ascension is the confirmation that what we're looking at is not an ordinary human being simply resuscitated or revived. I have to cite Lynn Cohick for this one. I heard her on a podcast recently, brought out that striking aspect of the Ascension. Just as the tomb or the burial of Jesus, Holy Saturday, confirms that Jesus really did die, that it was a death, a real death. The Ascension confirms that he really did rise from the dead. Not like Lazarus, who was simply alive again in the same way as before. Jesus is alive as a transfigured human. He will never die again. He can pass between heaven and earth without breaking a sweat. His degree of mobility has changed. This is not mortal flesh we're dealing with. His apparent physical movement away from them to heaven is more of a signal of his distinction and uniqueness in that respect than his distance from the disciples. Among all human beings, he alone has defeated death and inhabits this different kind of embodied humanity. He alone is capable of inhabiting this oft-mentioned, little-understood place called heaven. Therefore, he must be the one to go and make intercession, or do whatever you do in heaven. There's this matter of the cloud. I don't know about you, but when I think of Christian cloud imagery, I think of these common photos and paintings. You see them all the time. I had a Bible with a cover like this. Images of clouds, bright, fluffy, billowy white clouds in a brilliant blue sky, beams of sunlight pouring through. I've seen this background for Christian blogs. I've seen it on Christian CD covers. Frankly, quite gaudy. Sometimes clouds get worship songs written about them. Clouds on the bulletin at church. Clouds on the books in the Christian self-help section. Like it's supposed to give us the heart flutteries or something. It almost seems designed to produce this feeling of otherworldliness, ethereality, non-corporeal being. Up! Away! Somewhere other than Earth. It might even insinuate the nature of the future hope itself. A place where people walk on air for eternity, cloud hopping, harp in hand, never to be bothered with profane things like dirt or houses or ground or trees full of leaves or animals or the 5 senses ever again. We're out of here. Clouds. See the clouds, everybody? That's our destiny. Hope is in the clouds. Goodness gracious. What do clouds actually mean? The idea of someone coming on the clouds seems to evoke the image from Daniel 7, one like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven, to the Ancient of Days, God, to be given an everlasting kingdom, so that all nations will serve him. Consequent with that, you have these beasts, the other authorities of the world, that have their dominion taken away from them. Evil powers are being defeated. All of their dominion is being given to this Son of Man figure. And here we have Jesus ascending to heaven by being taken up into a cloud. Jesus uses the phrase Son of Man for himself in Luke about 26 times. The moment of Daniel 7 has come. Jesus is being given all dominion. The sign of the destruction of evil is at hand. Luke wants to tell you that Jesus is fulfilling the Daniel 7 prophecy right here at the Ascension. He's coming on the clouds of heaven. The one like a Son of Man is arriving at the Ancient of Days to receive dominion over the world. A large question mark appears here, though. In the next entry, I want to work on the question of where is Jesus, meaning where is he physically, but there's also the question of where is Jesus in terms of his power. If all this garbage is still happening in the world, we still have major personal, family, geopolitical problems, war, racism, divorce, child abuse. These very real concerns may be causing an unreal reading practice. I think this might be why some Christians like to shove every prophetic passage, every verse about the kingdom, every mention of judgment forward into the far future, making everything about the end of the world, even when a passage clearly isn't about that. Hyper-futurism. People look around and say, wow, things are still pretty messed up, and therefore Jesus can't have actually done anything all that significant, at least not for the real world. Kingdom means, at least for now, something about my heart. Jesus is king in my heart, maybe? Voila, spiritualized. Jesus, hyper-futurized. The real action is all going to be down the road somewhere. There's still sin and evil. For Jesus to be king, that would mean everything would be better. No, I don't think so. Regardless of the fact that I find this tendency to spiritualize and futurize to be pretty inadequate, maybe even illiterate at times, I do think there's an important question of theodicy when we think about something like the reign of King Jesus. And I'm not pretending I'm going to be able to put it to rest here in this humble video journal. I don't think so. I do think there's a future event we still await, but that the idea Jesus isn't king yet or is only spiritually king, don't think that's it. But hear this, the concern of theodicy is a serious one. Theodicy meaning how can God be good and powerful, yet evil still exists in the world? Or more specifically for us, how can Jesus have been given all dominion, as Daniel 7 seems to say via Acts 1? I hope maybe the shape of Acts will yield up some more fruit in this regard. And I have to admit I haven't thought that out ahead of time. In the meantime, though, I have a couple of images I want to call forth concerning this question, and not really from the perspective of pure logic, but from the perspective of maybe story logic or political logic. I think it's part of the answer. So in my household, we enthusiastically watched The Crown, starring Claire Foy, originally, as Queen Elizabeth, and now starring Olivia Colman. They changed out all the actors in season 3. Unbelievably good show. Loved every minute of it. Fascinating look into the royal family, the monarchy. Queen Elizabeth is the longest reigning British monarch in the history of British monarchs. Remarkable woman. We don't really know much about monarchy here in the US because we just stage a bloodless sort of revolution and overthrow every 4 to 8 years. But what's interesting about the Queen for our purposes is this moment of her accession to the throne. The moment it was announced publicly and in many different places that she had in fact become the new monarch. So the world, the Commonwealth in particular, might know to whom they now owe fealty. But the thing is, this moment of accession was not her coronation. That was different. The crowning, the moment where she literally had the crown placed on her head, came 14 months later. There was a substantial delay between the moment she acquired the throne and the moment she acquired the crown. More than that, she actually became queen, or succeeded to the throne, the moment her father died. The king is dead, long live the queen. This was private at first, only those attending the king knew, but Elizabeth became queen in that moment, though the average citizens did not immediately know it. Presumably, citizens proceeded on living as if the king were still the king for some short period after he was dead, until the announcement reached them. So we have at least 3 moments where the queen becomes the monarch, or at least acquires the adornments and appointments of her monarchy. Succession, accession, coronation. My British friends might correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I believe this is how royalty works. There must be pomp, there must be procession, there must be opulence and publicity, proclamation, trumpets. But for certain purposes of stability, practical matters of state, the actual monarchy was passed to her before any of that happened. So there's this sequence to the events by which the queen came into her queendom. The knowledge that the citizens have of the monarchy, and presumably some affairs of state, take time to transition. Good British citizen J.R.R. Tolkien, of course, was familiar with monarchy, and something like this appears in Lord of the Rings. Aragorn, known as Strider to the hobbits, is the rightful heir to the throne of Gondor and Arnor. But while Aragorn is rightfully deserving of the kingdom, a steward governs the kingdom in his place, and before Aragorn can make good on his claim to the throne in Minas Tirith, the steward must step aside, and a great battle must be fought. Urgent matters of cosmic fate loom before him. Sauron the enemy, is attacking, and in the coming battle, Aragorn will prove that he's worthy of the royal claim in practice as well as heritage. But until a certain point, his identity must be kept hidden from the spies of the enemy. In the meantime, however, under cover of night, the hidden king is able to steal into Minas Tirith, enter the houses of healing where the battle wounded lay, and exercise his healing gifts upon them, making the sick and the wounded well. And then before daylight reappears, he's gone, mostly unrecognized by anyone in the city. There are two more Old Testament echoes that I notice in the Ascension. The first, a cloud, features again. So in Exodus 24, when Moses went up Mount Sinai to receive the law from Yahweh, a cloud covered the mountain. And Yahweh commanded Moses to ascend into the cloud to meet him. Remember, the Israelites are led around the desert by the presence of Yahweh manifest as cloud and fire. We're dealing with the very presence of God here. The glory of God is in the cloud. That's because you can't see it. Clouds appear to be part of the comings and goings of important persons to God or to the place God has directed them. Moses ascended into the cloud, becoming invisible to those below, to receive the tablets of the law, to establish the covenant. He returns, and of course he finds the Israelites in rank idolatry, worshipping a calf of gold, and smashes the tablets of the law, calls mighty destruction and judgment down upon them, and the earth swallows a bunch of them and they die. He has to trundle back up the mountain and get version 2.0. The second echo is of Adam, the original human from Genesis 1. In ancient Near Eastern religion, the center of cultic life, or worship, was of course the local temple where a priesthood would present offerings to the local deity. The deity's presence was established in the temple as a statue, an idol, a physical image, which was of course forbidden in the Hebrew religion. The deity was there to maintain order in the kingdom, keep the blessings coming, bring favor to the nation, make our crops grow big, give us victory over our enemies. We need lots of kids, so help us with fertility and stuff like that. So a temple was built. The boundaries were set, the space was defined in which worship and priestly offerings would take place, and then the finishing touch, the most important part, was the statue of the god was placed in the center of the temple in the most holy place, and consecrated to take up residence there, to sit down at the helm, if you will, and commence operations, grant favor, keep order. But this trap gets sprung on us rather unexpectedly as we read Genesis 1. It appears that it is the story of the building of a temple, disguised as part of the Old Testament's cosmogonic story. Great word, cosmogonic. It means beginning of the world, cosmogonic. By the way, I'm getting this from John Walton, my professor right now, in his fabulous book, Ancient Near Eastern Thought in the Old Testament. So the story of creation is patterned after the creation of a temple. Boundaries are set, space is defined, land versus sea, and then a garden is created at the center of it all, the most holy place. And in the garden is placed the man, a physical figure made from the materials of the earth to represent God. The man is then consecrated with the breath of life and given a job, rule over the creation, cultivate the garden, bring forth fruit, show forth the Creator's benevolence to the world he lives in. Adam is God's vice-regent. He is exercising a reign over creation from his habitation, his holy place, in the garden. The creation story has features of the temple, and if you read the instructions for the building of the temple, later on in Leviticus, I believe, what do you know? The temple has features of creation. Lights, images of animals and birds, the bread of the presence, so the fruit of the earth, world, temple, world. The temple is a microcosm of the world, literally a microcosm, microcosmos, little world. One more thing about the temple. The Israelites believed that their temple in Jerusalem was a copy of the real temple, the dwelling place of Yahweh in heaven. Their temple was kind of like an earthly duplicate of the one where God resided, but it was still for earthly purposes the dwelling place of God. It was overlapping space, a consulate, you might say. A portal, maybe, enabling travel between the two worlds. Like a wormhole, a thing in space between two impossibly distant points in the galaxy. You go in one side of the wormhole and come out the other end instantly. Or think of a tesseract if you've read the Wrinkle in Time series by Madeleine L'Engle. The point was, it was the place where heaven and earth met, joined, where God would enter the earth, and where presumably a properly consecrated high priest could attend God in heaven. Okay, so in Luke 20 now. Jesus is in the temple teaching, and this is late in the story, so his death is imminent. His authority is challenged, as it often was, and there's this back and forth between him and the temple authorities, so they're grumbling about him and stuff. And he tells a parable. It's about a vineyard, or a garden. The owner leaves the garden for a long time and rents it out to tenants. The owner sends some servants to bring him some fruit from the garden. The tenants mistreat and abuse all of them. Finally, he sends his son to straighten things out, but instead of respecting the son, the tenants kill the son, thinking they'll get his share in the business. But no, most likely, says Jesus, the owner will just kill the tenants and get new ones when he comes back. So Jesus is telling a story about a garden in order to describe what is happening right then in the temple. The temple was created to mirror the garden. The story of creation's garden was narrated to mirror the construction of a temple. Garden, temple, world, temple. Garden, temple, world, temple. Jesus' parable is designed as a commentary on the whole life of the nation, vis-a-vis himself, even as that life is concentrated, distilled, liturgically embodied in the temple. Christocentric Bible interpretation for the win! And he's calling judgment down upon it, particularly on the authorities of the temple, and therefore the ostensible keepers of the conditions of God's presence on earth, the mediators of God's favor to the world. They are very bad people, and they confirm this by doing exactly what Jesus' parable prophesies, namely by executing him, likely for, at least in part, his controversial actions there in the temple of asserting his own authority, prophesying doom upon them, and insinuating that he was the real boss in those parts. So they kill him, but not before Pontius Pilate presents him before the crowd and declares, "Behold the man!" This on the 6th day of the week. That's in John's Gospel. Remember, the first man was created on the 6th day. Luke is presenting Jesus as, among other things, the figure of the deity residing in the temple that mediates the presence of God. His crucifixion gives us a grotesque impression of the fashioning of a physical idol for worship in parallel with the practices of pagan nations, after which he will be set in the temple to be worshipped. Moving out one layer further, he's being presented as the first man who images God in the garden at the center of creation, tasked with bringing order and causing it to bear fruit. So bring it back. We're at the Ascension. But having been raised from the dead, this new human being now ascends to heaven. Where would he be going? The heavenly temple. The temple from which God rules over heaven and earth, of which the earthly temple is a copy where Jesus did his rabble-rousing. The temples are a representation of the creation itself. Having been fashioned or perfected on the cross, Jesus ascends into the cloud. As the Creed puts it, he ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of God. He has been set down in the heavenly temple where he can receive worship and tribute, even more importantly, where he assumes position as the ruler of the cosmos, from which he maintains order, confers blessing, dispenses justice and victory, like the figure of the God placed in the center of a pagan temple, like Adam placed in the center of the cosmic garden. So who is Jesus? Jesus is the monarch, the priest, the lawgiver, the deity, the figure of the deity, the new human being, the progenitor of a new race, the gardener, the Son of Man elected by God, the bridge between the worlds. In the Ascension, he becomes cosmogonic. He's the beginning of a new world. And now I will ascend from the porch and bring forth the fruits of the refrigerator for lunch.